The silence that followed wasn't like the ordinary quiet of a room waiting for the next speaker. It was the kind that presses against your eardrums, the kind that makes everyone suddenly aware of their own breathing. I had heard that kind of silence before in operating rooms, in the seconds after a code, in the moment between the last beep and the flatline. I knew what it meant. It meant something had shifted, and nothing in the room would ever be quite the same again. My mother-in-law was still standing at the podium. Her hand was frozen mid-gesture. The champagne flute she'd been holding tilted at a precarious angle, and the smile she had worn all evening the practiced, luminous smile of a woman who had navigated hospital politics for 4 decades had gone completely still on her face. Not fallen. Not crumbled. Just stopped, the way a clock stops mid-tick. I looked at her from my seat at table 7 and felt nothing that resembled satisfaction. What I felt was older and quieter than that. I felt tired. And then, beneath the tired, I felt something closer to grief. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My mother-in-law had been chief of surgery at Hargrove Medical Center for 19 years before she retired to the board. In this city, in this hospital, that meant something. It meant her name was on a wing. It meant her portrait hung in the corridor outside the surgical suites, oil on canvas, hands folded, expression serene and absolute. It meant that when she walked into a room, people straightened imperceptibly, the way they do around anyone who has held real power long enough that the power has become part of their posture. She had welcomed me into the family with both hands. That was the thing I always had to remind myself of even later, even when it became difficult. She had embraced me at our engagement dinner, held my face between her palms and told my husband she approved. She had helped plan the wedding. She had sent flowers when our daughter was born, and again when our son was born 2 years later, and she had shown up both times with casseroles and a competence in grandmothering that genuinely moved me. The dismissal came later. Gradually, and then all at once. It started small. The way she'd redirect a conversation at dinner when I began talking about a case. The way she'd ask my husband questions about my work, as if I were not present to answer them myself. The way she'd mention, gently, that perhaps I was spreading myself thin. That perhaps what the children needed was more of my time at home, not less. These were not cruel statements. That was the difficulty. They were delivered with the same warm authority she applied to everything else, and my husband, who had been raised inside that authority, couldn't always distinguish care from control. 3 years before the gala, I had taken a leave of absence from Hargrove. I could not explain why. The terms of my agreement with the Department of Defense were explicit on that point. I was not to discuss the nature of the project, the location of my work, the specific protocols I was developing, or the outcomes associated with any of it. I could say I was consulting. I could say it was a federal contract. I could not say that I was working 16-hour days in a facility 200 miles outside of the city, developing a minimally invasive hemorrhage control technique designed for forward operating conditions. A procedure that could be performed with less than half the equipment of a standard OR, in the back of a vehicle if necessary, by a surgeon working without a team. I could not say that we ran 214 simulations before the first field application. I could not say that I lost 12 pounds in the first 6 months and couldn't tell my husband why I looked the way I looked when I came home on weekends. I could not say that on a Tuesday in March, 2 years into the project, I received a communication carefully worded, deliberately vague, telling me that the protocol had been used in an active theater of operations and that the outcome had been, in the language of the debrief, significant. I knew what significant meant. Significant meant someone was alive who otherwise would not have been. I came home and stood in the shower for a long time. What I could say, and what I did say, to my mother-in-law, to my husband's extended family, to colleagues at Hargrove who asked, I was doing consulting work I couldn't discuss. Federal. Confidential. The silence that followed that explanation was of a different variety than the one in the ballroom. It was the polite silence of people deciding, privately, what story to construct in the absence of the real one. My mother-in-law constructed hers efficiently. She was, after all, a woman who had spent decades making quick assessments. I watched the story settle behind her eyes over the course of several dinners, the story that I had, perhaps, overextended myself professionally. That I had taken on something I couldn't handle. That the federal consulting was a face-saving explanation for a quieter kind of retreat. She never said this. Not directly. What she said at a Sunday lunch about 14 months into my absence was, "It takes real courage to recognize your limits." I've always admired women who can do that. She was looking at me when she said it. My husband reached across the table and squeezed my hand. He meant it as support. I understood that. But the squeeze said, let it go, and that was the thing I could not say, that there was nothing to let go of. That I was not retreating. That the work I was doing was the most demanding thing I had ever attempted, and that I was doing it well. And that I could not tell him so in any way that would actually land. This is the particular loneliness of classified work. It doesn't ask you to lie. It just asks you to remain silent while other people fill the silence with their own conclusions, and to understand that correcting those conclusions is not permitted. I learned to set my jaw and pass the bread basket. The leave ended. I returned to Hargrove and resumed my surgical practice. The project's final debrief included a quiet commendation from the contracting office, which I filed in a drawer and did not mention to anyone. I was told the work would remain classified for a period not to exceed 5 years, subject to periodic review. That period, it turned out, would be 3 years and 4 months. The gala was Hargrove's centennial celebration, 100 years of the medical center, a black-tie dinner in the grand ballroom of the Ashworth Hotel, tables of 12 set with white linen and the particular floral arrangements that appear at every fundraising event in every major city, tasteful and seasonal and immediately forgettable. My mother-in-law had co-chaired the event committee. She had co-chaired everything at Hargrove since her retirement from active surgery. It was, I understood, how she maintained her orientation. Retired surgeons do not rest easily. My husband and I arrived together. He was handsome in his tux, genuinely happy to see colleagues, navigating the room with the ease of a man who had grown up attending these events. I wore the navy dress I'd bought 3 weeks earlier, not because I'd known what was coming, but because the event coordinator had called me the previous month with a request that I attend, phrased in the careful way of someone who is not yet authorized to tell you why. I knew the type of call. I had received similar ones before. I said I would be there. My mother-in-law found us near the bar during cocktail hour. She looked extraordinary, as she always did, silver hair, emerald earrings, the self-possession of a woman who has never once questioned her right to occupy the space she's standing in. She kissed my husband on both cheeks. She turned to me. You look lovely, she said. That color is very safe on you. Safe, not beautiful, not striking, safe. I smiled and thanked her. I'm glad you came, she continued. And there was something in the phrasing that I noticed, not glad you're here but glad you came, as if my attendance had been in question, as if I were a variable that might have been subtracted without affecting the outcome. Dinner was served. My mother-in-law was at the head table, my husband and I were at table 7, which was where they put people who are respected but not featured. I knew several people at the table, liked most of them, and spent the first hour in the comfortable rhythm of medical people at medical events, talking about cases in the oblique way you do in public spaces, referencing outcomes without referencing patients, letting the shorthand do its work. The program began after the main course. The board chair spoke. The chief of staff spoke. There was a retrospective video, 100 years of Hargrove, black and white photographs dissolving into color, the wing named after my mother-in-law appearing briefly on screen to modest applause from her table. Then the board chair said there was one more item on the program, unannounced, added late at the request of a federal agency he was not yet at liberty to name. The room settled into attentive confusion. My mother-in-law stepped to the podium to introduce what she clearly understood to be a standard recognition. Another donation, perhaps, or an institutional partnership. She had the look of someone who has been briefed at the last minute and is recovering gracefully. Hargrove has always been more than a hospital, she began, because she was, whatever else she was, an excellent speaker. It has been a training ground for physicians who go on to contribute not just to their communities but to the larger enterprise of medicine. She paused because a man had appeared at the side of the stage. He was not in military uniform. He was in a dark suit, and he carried a leather folder, and he walked with the precise economy of someone accustomed to being efficient in rooms where efficiency matters. He leaned toward my mother-in-law at the podium and said something I couldn't hear from table 7. What I saw was her face. The pause lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then she straightened, looked out at the room, and said, in a voice that had lost approximately 30% of its warmth, "It seems we have a yes. A presentation. From the Department of Defense." The man stepped to the podium. He introduced himself by name and title, a title that caused a ripple through the room. Because his agency was not one that typically appeared at hospital galas in civilian clothes bearing leather folders. 18 months ago, he said, a portion of a multi-year research initiative conducted under federal contract was recommended for declassification. That review was completed 6 weeks ago. What I'm here to do tonight is fulfill a commitment we made to one member of this institution, a commitment that was delayed, for reasons she understood and accepted without complaint, but which we felt obligated to honor publicly, given the nature of what she contributed. He opened the leather folder. I had been very still since he walked on stage. My husband had turned to look at me at some point. I registered this peripherally but did not look back at him. Over a period of 31 months, the man continued. A trauma surgeon on fellowship from this institution developed and validated a hemorrhage control protocol under forward operating conditions that has since been incorporated into the standard training curriculum of 3 branches of the Yetenstakable United States military. Since field implementation, this protocol has been a contributing factor in preventing hemorrhagic fatality in over 600 documented cases. That number will rise. It already has. He looked up from the folder. We are here tonight to present the Department of Defense Civilian Service Medal, with distinction, to Dr. And he said my name. The silence arrived immediately. I stood up from table 7. My husband made a sound I had not heard from him before. I walked to the stage with the same steadiness I use when I walk into an OR, not performed calm, just the actual condition of a person who has learned that everything necessary can be done without hurry. I shook the man's hand. I accepted the medal. I turned to face the room. My mother-in-law was still at the podium, one step to my left. I did not look at her directly, but I was aware of her the way you're aware of weather as a condition of the environment, something you account for without fixing your attention on it. I did not speak for a long time. The room did not fill the silence. They seemed to understand, collectively, that the silence was mine. I want to be clear about something, I said finally. I'm not here tonight because of what I accomplished. I'm here because of what the work was for. Every one of those 600 cases is a person who is alive. That's not an abstraction. Those are people who went home. And if there's anything I want you to take from this room tonight, it's that the most important work is often the work that can't be talked about. Not because it's shameful, but because protecting it is part of what makes it matter. I paused. I also want to say because I think honesty is the only thing worth practicing at this point in an evening, that the years I spent on this project were the loneliest of my professional life. Not because of the work. The work was extraordinary. But because the silence required of me was a silence I couldn't explain to the people I loved, and I watched some of those relationships absorb the weight of that without knowing what they were holding. My husband was looking at me from table 7. His face was doing several things at once. Silence in service of something larger than yourself is not the same as surrender, I said. I want to make sure I believed that, because there were days I had to remind myself. I thanked the department. I thanked Hargrove. I stepped back. The applause started at table 7 and moved outward. My mother-in-law did not return to the podium that evening. During the reception that followed, I found her standing near the windows overlooking the city, alone in the particular way that people are alone at crowded events when something has altered their center of gravity. She was holding her champagne flute the way she'd held it at the podium, not drinking, just holding, as if she had forgotten it was there. I walked over. She saw me coming and did not look away, which told me something important about her that I had perhaps underweighted in my assessment of her character. She was not the kind of person who avoids the accounting. I made assumptions, she said, before I had a chance to say anything. About your judgment, about your capabilities, about what the absence meant. She said it precisely, the way she would have presented a difficult diagnosis without softening it into inaccuracy. You did, I said. I was wrong. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. Below us, the city went about its business, indifferent to the small reckonings taking place inside this ballroom. You could have corrected me, she said. Not with the classified material. But you could have pushed back more forcefully. Made me understand there was more to know. I could have, I agreed. I chose not to. She looked at me directly for the first time all evening, not the social direct gaze she deployed at events, but something more unguarded than that. Why? I thought about this. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I wanted to give it to her accurately. Because I wasn't trying to prove something to you, I said. I was doing work that mattered. The work didn't need your approval to matter. And I understood, even when it was difficult, that the two things were separate. She absorbed this. I owe you an apology, she said. Several. Probably. You do. I would like to give you one. I know. She set down her champagne flute on the windowsill and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked back at me with an expression I had not seen on her before, something younger, somehow, and less certain, and more honest for the uncertainty. Will you let me? She asked. I thought about the Sunday lunches and the bread basket and the word safe and the years of carrying something I couldn't set down, in a house that should have been a place to rest. I thought about my husband's face at table 7 when he finally understood. I thought about 600 people who went home. Yes, I said. She nodded once. The kind of nod that means something has been decided and will be honored. We stood at the windows for a while without speaking. Below us, the city moved through the ordinary business of a Thursday night, people getting into cabs, couples walking, someone running for a bus, entirely unaware of the 100-year gala above them. The medal, the silence, the apology extended and received between two women at a window, both of them deciding, without saying so, what the next part of things would look like. My husband found me 20 minutes later. He had been talking to someone from the board. But when he crossed the room toward me, he was not the practiced social presence I was used to watching work a room. He was just a man walking toward his wife with a particular look on his face. He put both hands on my face the way his mother had done at the engagement dinner, and I thought briefly about inheritance, what we take from the people who raise us, and what we choose. How much of it, he asked. How much did you carry without telling me? All of it, I said. He closed his eyes. I'm sorry, he said. I'm sorry I didn't push harder. I'm sorry I let her. You didn't know what you were excusing, I said. That's different. It's not entirely different. No, I agreed. But it's different enough. He pulled me in and held me with the careful intensity of someone who has just understood the precise dimensions of what they almost failed to see. I let him. Not because the holding fixed anything, but because some things need to be witnessed, even when they're over. Later, after the valet brought our car, after we were on the freeway heading home, after the city had contracted into the usual pattern of exit signs and headlights, he asked me, "What happens now? With your mother?" "She wants to apologize," I said. "She should. She knows that." He was quiet for a mile or two. The freeway sounds filled the car, the particular white noise of late-night driving. "Do you think she'll actually change?" he asked. I considered this with the same care I'd given everything else that night. "I don't know," I said. "I think she wants to. And I think she's the kind of person who does the things she decides to do. That could go either way. Most things do." He laughed softly. It was the right kind of laugh, not dismissive, just human. The laugh of someone releasing tension he'd been holding since the moment his wife's name was said at a podium and the entire architecture of a misunderstanding came down around him in an otherwise unremarkable hotel ballroom. I watched the exit signs go past. The work had been long and silent, and mine. The silence had cost something real. But the work had been worth every hour of it, and the silence had not been wasted, had been the container the work required. These two things were both true, and I was done pretending they canceled each other out. 600 people went home. That was always going to be enough. 6 weeks after the gala, my mother-in-law asked if she could have lunch with me. Just the two of us. She chose a restaurant I liked, not her usual place. Mine, and she arrived before me, which I recognized as its own form of message. We ordered. We talked, at first, about the children, the easy shared ground that had always functioned between us even when everything else was complicated. Then, without transition or preamble, she set down her fork and said what she had come to say. She had been thinking, she told me, about the particular kind of arrogance that masquerades as mentorship. The assumption that experience confers not just knowledge but judgment about other people's choices. She had mistaken the two for a long time. She was aware of it now in a way she hadn't been, and she understood that awareness was not the same as repair, and that repair would require time and consistency she hadn't yet demonstrated. "I want to demonstrate it," she said. "I'm not asking you to assume I will. I'm asking for the chance to show you." I looked at the woman across the table, the portrait in the hallway, the emerald earrings, the 19 years of a career that had mattered, and behind all of it, the genuine love she had for her son and her grandchildren, imperfect and real. "You have the chance," I said. "You've always had it." She nodded. We finished lunch. Outside, she surprised me, reached over and squeezed my hand, briefly, The same way my husband had at that Sunday lunch years ago, but with an entirely different meaning, not let it go. Something more like I see you. Something more like I was wrong to do otherwise. I squeezed back. The street was ordinary midday traffic. Someone walking a dog, a delivery truck double parked with its hazards on. The kind of scene that holds no particular significance, except that it was the scene around us when something mended slightly. Not all the way. Not yet. But slightly, which is where all mending begins. I walked back to the hospital. I had a procedure at 2 o'clock. A difficult one. The patient had been on my mind all morning, the anatomy complicated, the margin for error narrow. I scrubbed in with the focused attention that the work always brought, that clean narrowing of the field to what matters, what can be done, what the moment requires. The technique I used was one I had refined over 31 months in a facility 200 miles away, in conditions that bore no resemblance to this room, for purposes I had not been able to name. It worked exactly as it was designed to work. That was everything.